The Veth Corps military garrison's checkpoint was staffed for the day rotation when Davan Rourke arrived, which meant it was staffed correctly. The 6 soldiers in their positions, the documentation verification system active, the command-level officer present, because the incoming manifest had flagged his documentation for command review, which was the standard flag for Confederacy Trade Commission couriers on outer system routes, and which meant nothing except that the documentation format required the senior officer's credential code rather than a subordinate's. He had been flagged for command review at 14 of the last 19 checkpoints on his current route, which was a statistic he had assembled because assembling operational statistics was the habit of someone who had spent 2 years managing logistics and 4 years as a courier, and which meant nothing except that the Commission's documentation format was idiosyncratic in ways that triggered the flag reliably. He waited at the checkpoint's designated approach position and watched the commanding officer come out of the garrison's entrance with the specific, efficient quality of a Veth military officer, conducting a function that was not her most interesting function, but was her current one, and was therefore receiving her full attention. He knew the species from the briefing files and from the 2 years that preceded the briefing files, which had made the briefing files feel, when he had read them on the transit to his first posting, like a summary of things he already knew at a different level of detail. Commander Vel Sorenketh was the name on the garrison's command roster, which he had reviewed as part of the standard pre-delivery research that his predecessor in the courier program had recommended, and which he had adopted because his predecessor had been doing this for 9 years, and the recommendations of 9-year practitioners were worth adopting unless there was a specific reason not to. She stopped at the correct distance. She said in Standard Galactic, which was correct, identification. He provided it, purpose of visit. He stated it, the documentation you're carrying, authorization chain. The authorization chain question was the one that had a long answer if you gave it in standard. Because the Commission's authorization structure had 3 levels of approval for outer system documentation, and each level had a designation code, and explaining the structure to someone unfamiliar with it required the explanation to go in a specific order, or it became confusing. And he had explained it in standard at 14 checkpoints, and had the explanation organized. The answer in standard was going to take approximately 90 seconds. He had learned the Veth word for the Commission's senior authorization level from the senior medical officer at Keth 4, who had been receiving Commission supply documentation for 2 years, and had found the Commission's authorization structure confusing until he had, at some point in the middle of the first year, explained it to her in Veth because they were discussing a supply delay, and the explanation was faster and more precise in Veth than it was in standard. And she had found this useful, and he had found it useful, and they had continued to use Veth for the specific, technical discussions that benefited from Veth's precision in those areas. He gave the authorization chain explanation in Veth. The thing about the Veth chromatic response system was that it operated independently of conscious control, which was the thing he had learned to read first because it was the most honest indicator of what was actually happening in the person he was talking to. The senior medical officer had explained this to him in the 2nd month, when he had asked about a specific response pattern he had been observing, and she had said, "We cannot lie in our chromatic responses the way you can lie in your facial expressions. What you see is what is present." What was present in Commander Vel Sorenketh in the 3 seconds after his response completed was the chromatic spike at the neck and upper torso that indicated acute input requiring immediate processing, followed by the specific, held quality of the processing itself, followed by the secondary color shift at the temples that he had come to associate with the moment. The processing produced a result that the person was uncertain what to do with. He noted this and looked at the soldiers. The soldiers were doing the other thing. He had seen this once before in the field hospital in the 8th month, when he had spoken to a patient in front of 3 of the medical personnel who had not yet heard him do it, which had produced the specific, collective quality of people receiving information that reorganized a category they thought was settled. The weapons were at the lowered position, not grounded, not holstered, just lowered in the specific, involuntary way of hands that were getting instructions from a system that was occupied elsewhere. The postures had the specific quality of people who had been at professional readiness and were now at something else, something for which professional readiness did not have a designation because professional readiness was for expected categories of event, and this was not in the expected categories. He looked back at the commander. She said in Veth, in the specific, careful way of someone testing the result of the processing, "Say that again." He said it again. The authorization chain structure, the 3 approval levels, the designation codes, the correct sequence for understanding it. He said it in the formal military register, because she was a commanding officer, and the formal military register was correct for addressing a commanding officer, which was a register he had learned in the 2nd year from the documentation he had been receiving, and from the correction the senior medical officer had applied when he had used the wrong register in a formal context, and she had explained. In the specific patient way, she explained things that mattered, why it mattered. The commander's chromatic response did the thing it had done after the first time, but more slowly, the processing running again on the same input, producing the same result, the uncertainty about what to do with the result still present, but now accompanied by the shift that indicated the processing had moved from "what is this" to "what do I do with this?" She said how. It was the complete question in Veth, in the tone of someone for whom the one word was sufficient, because the one word contained everything she was actually asking. He said, in Veth, in the same register, "There was a field hospital on Keth for 2 years. I was in the logistics function for the Commission's supply chain support. The wounded children responded better to their own language than to Standard. It took approximately 4 months to produce the first recognizable phonemes, and 8 months before the medical personnel stopped wincing." She looked at him. He said, "The metric I was using was when the children stopped asking me to repeat myself. That took about a year." She said, "The children." "Yes," he said, "that was the motivation. The soldiers had not moved." He was aware of this in the peripheral accounting that had become automatic. 6 people at the lowered weapons position, at the specific, unusual stillness of people who had been running the standard protocol, and were now in a moment that the standard protocol did not have a procedure for. The commander said something that was not part of the procedure, directed over her shoulder, and the soldiers executed the movement that dismissed them from their formal positions to their rotation, which they did with the specific, functional quality of soldiers following an order, and the additional quality of people who were following the order through a layer of something else, the something else being the collective processing they were taking with them. She looked at him. "The senior medical officer at Keth 4, she said, "Name." He told her. The chromatic response at the commander's temples did the 3rd kind of shift, not the acute input spike, not the uncertain result held quality, but the softer and slower shift of something being recognized rather than assessed. He had seen this shift before. He had learned it meant the person was encountering something that had a prior history in them rather than something that was entirely new. "She corrected your register," the commander said. "In the 2nd year," he said. "I had been using the standard formal register for the documentation contexts, and she told me the High Command dialect's military formal register was different, and that if I was going to use the language in formal contexts, I should use it correctly." "That is something she would say," the commander said, "in those words." "Very nearly," he said. She looked at him in the full Veth way of looking, which was the non-divided attention of a species for whom divided attention was a trained skill, and undivided attention was the natural state, the complete, direct quality of being seen by someone who was applying full processing to what they were seeing. She never told me, the commander said, that a human had learned Veth. I don't think she considered it the most notable thing about the logistics coordination, he said. The supply chain for the second stage medical equipment was the most notable thing. The procurement delays in the second year. She wrote about the procurement delays, the commander said, in her field reports. The Commission's documentation quality. The Commission's documentation quality was a recurring subject, he said. The phrasing she used, the commander said, was unnecessarily arcane. She said that to me also, he said, in year 1. It was part of why I developed the Veth explanation for the authorization chain structure. The Veth explanation is less arcane. The commander looked at him with the expression he did not have a Veth term for yet. You are a diplomatic courier, she said. Yes, he said, for 4 years. 4 years, he said. Before that, logistics coordination. Emergency response deployment, he said. Commission support for field operations. Keth 4, she said. And 3 others, he said. Keth 4 was the longest. The others were shorter postings, the infrastructure failures that resolved faster than Keth 4. She was quiet for a moment in the specific, considered way of someone who was organizing what they had received into the order that let them proceed. The documentation review process, she said. Standard timeline. 48 hours on the administrative side, he said. The garrison's administrative office opens at 0800, she said. The review will be complete by 0800 the following day. Standard practice is for couriers to be available for procedural questions during the review period. Yes, he said, which means your presence at the garrison is operationally justifiable for the review period, she said. Yes, he said. The officers' dining facility serves at 1900, she said. The senior medical officer's practice, when I served under her, was to include the logistics and support personnel in the evening meal when the operational context made it appropriate. What made it appropriate, he said. When they had done the work that needed doing, she said, and when she had questions about the work. He looked at her. Do you have questions about the work, he said. I have questions about the authorization chain structure, she said, among other things. The Veth explanation is clearer than the standard one, he said. I have found that to be the case, she said, with most things. He looked at the garrison's entrance, which the soldiers had returned to after their rotation dismissal, who were not looking at him in the specific, performative way of people who were paying careful attention to not appearing to pay attention. She would have approved of this, he said. Not performing the certainty, just the plain account of what he knew from 2 years of daily work alongside someone whose approval he had found he valued, and whose opinion he had come to be able to estimate accurately. Of what specifically, she said. Of the Veth explanation being clearer, he said, and of the practical application of something that was difficult to acquire. She had a specific view of difficulty, the commander said. Her view was that difficulty was a description of the gap between current capability and required capability, and that the gap was navigable if the requirement was sufficient. Yes, he said, that is what she said to me also. In year 1, when I told her the phoneme production was not going well. What did she say exactly? The commander said. She said, the children need to hear their language from you. Whether your anatomy cooperates is a secondary problem. Start with the requirement and work backward to the capability. The commander looked at the checkpoint station, which was processing nothing at the moment because the processing had been concluded, and the interaction had moved past the protocol into something the protocol did not cover. That is her, she said, quietly, in the way of someone who had heard something and it had landed in the place that things landed when they were the specific, accurate version. Yes, he said, it is. The garrison's logistics office processed his documentation intake with the specific, functional efficiency of a military administrative system, doing the thing it was designed to do. And he was given the courier's temporary quarters designation and the operating schedule and the access limitations. which were the standard intake for a visiting courier, and which he received in standard, because the administrative staff had not been at the checkpoint and had no context for the alternative. He put his bag in the temporary quarters, which were functional in the way of military installation temporary quarters. The specific, compressed adequacy of a space that had been designed for someone who needed to sleep and store their belongings, and had not been designed for anything else. He reviewed the documentation he was carrying, which was the courier's standard pre-review preparation, verifying the package integrity and the contents inventory, and the authorization codes that would be confirmed by the administrative review, which was a verification of his own verification, which was the specific, redundant quality of a system that had decided redundancy was preferable to the alternative. The authorization codes were correct. The package integrity was confirmed. He noted this in the courier log and put the documentation in the secure carry case and looked at the time display, which showed 3 hours before the dining facility's service. He thought about the checkpoint. He thought about it in the specific, methodical way he thought about significant things, not the drama of it, which was not his register for his own experiences, but the information it contained. The commander had known the senior medical officer. The senior medical officer had been the specific, significant person she had been to him, the one who had given the correction and the standard and the view of difficulty that had been, across 2 years, the organizing principle of the work. He had not known that the senior medical officer had served with anyone who had come through a garrison on his courier route. He had not known, because it had not been available to know until 37 minutes ago. He thought about the shift in the commander's chromatic response when she had recognized the name. He had learned to read the chromatic system, because it was honest in the way the senior medical officer had described. The responses were present and visible, and were what they were, and reading them correctly was the specific skill of someone who had spent 2 years in daily proximity to a species whose emotional state was more visible than most. He had read the recognition shift correctly. She had known the senior medical officer in the way of someone for whom the knowing had weight. The 3 years she had mentioned, the field reports about the procurement delays, the specific accuracy with which she had reproduced the view of difficulty. He thought about the evening and what it was going to contain. He thought about the Veth language and what it did to conversation, the specific, particular quality of speaking in a language that had been learned for precision rather than for range. The way the learning had organized itself around the medical context first, and had then expanded outward into the things you needed to say when you were doing 2 years of daily work with people who used that language for everything. The precision was different from standard's precision. Veth organized meaning around relationship and register, and the specific weight of words in context. And 2 years of learning, it had given him a relationship with it that standard did not have the same version of. He thought about the diagnostic questions that were coming and whether he would use Veth or standard to answer them. He thought he would use whichever was more accurate. The officer's dining facility was the size of a room that had been designed for utility rather than atmosphere, which was consistent with the rest of the garrison's architecture, and which had the specific, functional quality of a space that served its purpose correctly without serving any additional purpose. The tables were the standard military installation configuration. Long, communal, the arrangement that made it efficient to serve many people rather than the arrangement that made it comfortable for 2. The commander was at the table at the far end, which was the end that the garrison's ranking officer occupied at the evening meal, and which had the specific, slight distinction from the other seating of a position that was not formally elevated, but was understood to be distinct. He sat at the table, not at the far end, because that was her position, and not at the near end, because that was as far as possible and the distance would have been its own statement. He sat at the middle of the long table, and the orderly brought the evening meal, and he ate the first part of it in the specific, practical way of someone who had been in enough military installation dining facilities to have developed a neutral relationship with military installation food. She came to his section of the table. She sat across from him, which was not the commanding officer's position in the facility's spatial hierarchy, but was where she chose to sit, and she had a bowl of the same thing he was eating, and she looked at him in the full, direct Veth way. "The authorization chain structure," she said. "Explain it to me." He explained it. He explained it in Veth, in the organized sequence that made it clear, with the designation codes in the Veth transliteration that the senior medical officer had used in the field reports, and that he had used with her when explaining the supply delays. The commander listened with the complete attention, and then said the word for the second-level approval designation, which she had said incorrectly by a phoneme. Not a meaningful error in standard transliteration, but an error in Veth, where the phoneme carried tonal information that changed the level's formal weight. He said the correct version. She said it again correctly. She would make me repeat it until I had it, he said. Yes, the commander said. She was consistent about that. It was useful, he said. I made fewer errors in formal contexts, because the corrections happened before the formal contexts rather than during them. She did not like errors in formal contexts, the commander said. No, he said. The phrasing she used, the commander said, was that errors in formal register were a form of disrespect to the subject. Yes, he said, she said that to me. I had used the informal register in a documentation handover, and she told me the documentation deserved the formal register, because the documentation was about the supply chain for the second-stage medical equipment, and the equipment was for the patients, and the patients deserved to be discussed with the weight that using the correct register communicated. The commander looked at her bowl, she looked at him. She wrote about you, she said. He looked at her. In her personal correspondence, she said, not the field reports. We maintained contact after I transferred from her command. She wrote about the logistics coordinator who was learning Veth. She paused. She did not use your name. She described you as the human who decided the phoneme production problem was a logistics constraint and began treating it accordingly. He thought about this. That is an accurate description, he said. That was the framework I used. She approved of the framework, the commander said. She said it was the most Veth approach to a problem she had seen a human take. I learned it from her, he said. The approach. Yes, she said. She wrote that also. He looked at the table. He looked at the facility, which was doing its meal service business with the specific, efficient quality of a military installation, doing the function it was designed for. He looked at the commander. How is she? He said. The commander looked at him. She retired from field service 8 months ago, she said. She is on Veth Prime. She is writing the documentation of the Keth 4 medical protocols for the core training program. She paused. She said in her last correspondence that the documentation was more difficult than the field work because the field work had been specific and the documentation had to be general, and that generalizing from specific experience was the hardest form of writing. That sounds right, he said. She was always more comfortable with the specific. Yes, the commander said. The specific was where she was most herself. He thought about this. He thought about 2 years of daily work in a specific context, with a specific person doing a specific function, and what that kind of specificity produced in the people who shared it. The specific, indelible familiarity of people who had been in the same place doing the same necessary thing, and had become known to each other through the doing. The children from Keth 4, he said, do you know? The colony's restoration was completed 14 months ago, she said. The infrastructure has been rebuilt. The medical corps conducted a follow-up assessment last year. She looked at him with the full attention. The pediatric outcomes from the field hospital were documented. The assessment noted that the second-stage care period produced recovery rates above the standard model. The documentation attributes it to the specific quality of the staff attentiveness during the period. He thought about this in the specific, plain way of someone receiving information that had been in the category of things he had not known the outcome of, and was now being placed in the other category. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat for a moment in the way of people who had arrived at a piece of information together and were present with it, which was the kind of moment that did not require anything except the being present. "The Keth 4 protocol documentation," he said. "If she is writing it for the training program, the logistics function will be part of it." "Yes," the commander said. "The Commission's authorization structure is going to be in it," he said. "The arcane version." "Probably," she said. "If she would accept a supplementary note," he said. "The Veth explanation is clearer." The commander looked at him. The expression, the third kind, the one he did not have a Veth term for yet, and was now, across the dinner and the conversation and the specific, particular quality of the evening, developing a better sense of. "I will pass the offer along," she said. "She can decline it," he said. She had specific views about unsolicited contributions to documentation. "She did," the commander said. "She also had specific views about contributions that improved the precision of the thing being documented." She paused. "She would tell you to submit the note through the correct channel with the correct register and let it be assessed on its merits." "What is the correct channel?" he said. "For contributions to the core training program documentation," she said. "The submissions channel routes through the Garrison Command Review before reaching the core documentation office." He looked at her. "The Garrison Command Review," he said. "Standard routing for outer system submissions," she said. "It ensures the documentation meets the core standards before reaching the documentation office." "I see," he said. "The review timeline," she said, "is approximately the same as a documentation administrative review." 48 hours, he said. "Approximately," she said. He looked at the facility. He looked at the remaining portion of the evening meal. He looked at the commander, who was looking at him with the full, direct Veth attention, and the expression he was going to have a term for by the time the 48 hours was done. "I can have the note drafted by tomorrow morning," he said. "The submissions channel opens at 0800, she said. "I am aware of the garrison's operating schedule," he said. "Yes," she said. "The pre-delivery research." "Standard practice," he said. "It is a good practice," she said. He thought about the senior medical officer writing documentation on Veth Prime, the general version of the specific experience, the hardest form of writing. He thought about her field reports and the procurement delays and the phrase unnecessarily arcane. He thought about the note he was going to write, which was going to be in Veth, in the correct formal register, because the documentation deserved the formal register, and the formal register communicated that the thing being discussed had weight. "The correct Veth term," he said, "for the Commission's senior authorization level. She gave me the technical term and the formal register version. The formal register version is more precise for documentation purposes." "Tell me," the commander said. He told her. She said it. He said the correction, one phoneme, the tonal shift that the formal register required. She said it again correctly. "She would have made you repeat it until you had it," she said. "Yes," he said, "she would." "Then you understand the method," she said. "I do," he said. "Good," she said. "The note will be more useful if the register is correct throughout." "I will make sure it is," he said. She looked at him with the expression. He was going to have a term for it by the time the 48 hours was done. He was looking forward to finding it.